welcome everybody to the webinar for Ontario or the Operation Bait Bucket and the new bait regulations in Ontario. Thanks for coming out. We're going to probably jump right in, and so I'm going to share my screen here. So as it says at the beginning here, and the title has Brooke Schreier, Matt Robbins. Unfortunately, my colleague wasn't able to attend, but so you've got me today, Matt Robbins, and well, we'll get into introductions in a second here. Just a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. We'll quickly touch on who we are, so ISAP and the OFAH, as well as what OBB, Operation Bait Bucket, is. We're going to talk about aquatic invasive species, a couple of species in particular that are actually already within the Lake Simcoe watershed. We're going to go over the new bait regulations that have just come out, just been put into force on January 1st of this year, so about 2 weeks ago now. And then at the very end, we can take questions and comments, and hopefully we'll do our best certainly to answer those for you. So today you've got me, as I said, Matt Robbins. I'm the Aquatic Outreach Liaison for the Invading Species Awareness Program, and help answer questions related to regulations and enforcement. We also have Brenda Keonig, who works at the NDMNRF as a Provincial Enforcement Specialist. So to begin with, I'm just going to quickly go over who we are. So I work for the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, which is the largest nonprofit fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario. And really the objectives of the OFAH are to protect fishing, hunting, and trapping opportunities, promote safe and responsible participation in these activities, and ultimately sort of champion conservation. Within the OFAH, we have ISAP, which is the Invading Species Awareness Program. And our focus specifically is on education and awareness. So we're a partnership between the OFAH and the MNRF, and we focus on sort of key pathways of introduction and spread of invasive species. We focus on facilitating monitoring and early detection initiatives. So a great example of that would be our Invading Species Hotline. We also work closely with EDMAPs. And we also do a lot of work in just supporting surveillance, control, and response initiatives, whether they're pre-existing or whether we have a hand in developing them. So everything from wild pigs, we're heavily involved in the wild pig surveillance program, to the water soldier eradication program and mystery snail management and removal program up in Haliburton. We've got a hand in all those types of things. Operation Bait Bucket specifically is a program within the program that basically has the goals of increasing awareness about maintaining the health of Lake Simcoe specifically, and preventing, basically just spreading awareness of how to prevent invasive species and diseases from spreading around. We're focusing on letting anglers know not to dump their leftover bait into the lake or on the ice, and also encouraging anglers to buy bait locally. So the message sort of Operation Bait Bucket is the one you see down here, just don't dump your bait. That is our key message. Now OBB originally, it began in 2017, and the original intention was actually to be out and on the ice, engaging with anglers and hut operators, and we did that for a little while, but for a number of reasons, it has been mostly virtual since 2019, and so we're promoting the same message, but through social media, information sessions like what we're doing right now, working with partners like online forums, for instance. If I'm sure some of you use Lake Simcoe Outdoors, we've worked with them, and and other ways to sort of distribute resources, whether physical or virtual, around this message. So like I said, the primary message is just don't dump your bait, and that we're trying to make people aware that it's actually illegal to deposit the contents of a bait bucket, whether it's water or soil or other material or live or dead bait, into the water, or to dispose of them within 30 meters of the water. And that does include on the ice. So before we get into any specific species today, we've got to sort of talk about what an invasive species is, and conversely, what an alien species is. So we'll start with the idea of an alien species. It's sort of synonymous with introduced or non-native species. And what this is just essentially any organism that's introduced outside of its natural past or present distribution. They're introduced by human action, either accidentally or even on purpose in some cases. So an example of a non-native species would be Chinook salmon, which are from the West Coast, but they were introduced into the Great Lakes in the 60s to control invasive alewife. So a non-native species, an alien species, isn't inherently problematic, not by its nature necessarily. It becomes invasive when it becomes dangerous or damaging. So an aquatic invasive species, on the other hand, is a non-native fish, aquatic animal or plant that are also introduced outside of their historic and natural range, and either do cause harm or have the potential to cause harm to the environment, whether that's biodiversity, species health, abundance, to the economy. So that could be, tourism dollars, it could be property damage, something like that, or to society as a whole. And that sort of includes human health. So, think zebra mussels and cutting people's feet. That's when we call something an invasive species rather than just a non-native or an alien species. The next thing to talk about is how these species get around. So we generally refer to the means by which an invasive species moves from one area to another as pathways or vectors of spread. Those words are sort of synonymous in this case. And there are obviously natural vectors. So you can, think of animals moving things around, whether it's seeds or something like that, dispersal by wind, water currents. There's all sorts of potentially natural vectors of spread. And then there are man-made vectors of spread. And so in the case of aquatic invasive species, sort of the classic examples, really it's the stuff we're dealing with today in this conversation, would be contaminated gear. So maybe your angling equipment that has an organism caught up in it, or getting stuck to boats is a really, really common one. Getting stowing away sort of in the water in a ballast tank of a large ship or a small recreational vessel. Also a really big one, and this is obviously very pertinent to the presentation today, is bait buckets. So a really significant pathway for AIS, particularly in the winter, is stowing away in the water in somebody's bait bucket. So today I wanted to talk about a couple of sort of, they're quintessential aquatic invasive species for Lake Simcoe. I think that most of you will know about at least a few of these already, and that's okay. We're really looking to sort of form a baseline knowledge and just get the idea out there that, these are some of the problems associated with some of these very common invasives. And that's why we, don't want other aquatic invasive species to come into Lake Simcoe, and B, don't want these species to go out. So by no means is this an exhaustive list. Lake Simcoe actually has upwards of 19 aquatic invasive species, including plants and such. But today we're going to talk in detail about just a few. So the first one is very obvious, I'm sure, to all of you anglers out there. You know, I'm an avid angler on Lake Simcoe as well. And, you know, for the last decade or so, we've all sort of adapted our lures to look like gobies in a lot of cases, particularly with whitefish. So this is a round goby. It's native to Eastern Europe, and it was first introduced into Ontario through the ballast water of ships. That would be in the 80s and 90s probably, and initially it went to Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair River, but since then it has spread, partially because they naturally migrate, these fish, when they get into a system, and partially through bait buckets. So almost certainly the way that they got into Lake Simcoe was somebody bringing a bait bucket from another area that had them and not noticing a little goby in there. And at the end of the day, they dumped their bait overboard or down the hole, or I guess it would take more than one. And those fish established in Lake Simcoe. And so we've had them in Lake Simcoe since 2006. That's when they were first detected. So gobies tend to prefer sort of shallow habitats, although they are pretty tough and resilient. They can adapt for sure, but generally it's fairly shallow environments, and that makes them sort of ideal as a food choice for a lot of sport fish, as we know. And when it comes to identifying gobies, there are a couple really easy ways of differentiating between them and sort of similar lookalikes. And this is important because we get calls fairly often of people thinking they found a goby in a northern lake and they're worried that it's infested, but actually it's a sculpin most of the time. Fingers crossed, it's going to be a sculpin of some kind. They look fairly similar. One of the key identifying features, though, is this black dot on the dorsal fin of the round goby. The sculpins won't have that. There's slimy sculpins, mottled sculpins, a number of different species, but that's a distinguishing feature. And then the other really big one is that this right here, the pelvic fin, is actually fused and it creates a suction cup looking setup. And actually gobies do use it as a suction cup to hang on to rocks and such. So that's pretty unique. If you were to look underneath the sculpin, this pelvic fin would be two pelvic fins, like most fish. An additional identifying feature is that the males, when they're spawning, they turn jet black like this, but of course that's not all year round. In terms of the impact gobies have, this is a really important conversation for Lake Simcoe in particular, because I know that some people feel that ultimately gobies were a good thing in the system because they feed sport fish. And it's true that there is actually some evidence to suggest that with the introduction of gobies into a system, the size of certain sport fish when adult can get bigger on average. We also know that the presence of gobies is associated with an overall decrease in the actual population of these sport fish that we love. The reason being, gobies are really effective predators, really effective at reproducing. They're sort of they're very effective invasive species. So for one thing, they can spawn upwards of 3 times in a season. And that's bad news because most native fish cannot do that. So what that means is that when they are predated on by, say, a bass, those bass just can't keep up with the amount of reproduction going on. So our native species can't keep up in terms of predation. Then the gobies will outcompete other bottom-dwelling fish like darters and log perch, and they sort of displace them. And so suddenly the bottom ecosystem or bottom system there becomes primarily gobies. And they're such effective, aggressive predators that when it comes to spawning season for a lot of our sport fish, they are really good at getting in those nests and completely, in a lot of cases, just eliminating the eggs. So they'll eat eggs very quickly, very effectively, and also feed on the young of sportfish. So ultimately, there's reductions associated with having gobies in a water body in terms of the overall population of our fish. So even if if it happens to be that we do get some larger average adults, it's at the expense of the overall population. On top of that, gobies have been associated with spreading botulism type E to fish-eating birds, which is a disease that's caused some die-off there in the Great Lakes as well. So that's a problem. And this is a map of our current understanding of the distribution of round gobies in Ontario. So you can see that it basically follows along some of the more populated parts of Ontario, and that is pretty common for invasive species because they go where we go. You know, in the case of a goby, it goes where our bait buckets and our ballast tanks go. All right, so the next one is also pretty obvious, I think, for most of you. Zebra mussels are a well-known thing in this part of Ontario and especially in Lake Simcoe. They're a freshwater bivalve that's native to the Ponto-Caspian regions of Eurasia. And they were first detected in Lake Simcoe in 1993. Now, when it comes to mussels like these, generally they spread by sticking to things. So they'll be stuck to the sides of boats and equipment, or by sort of free floating in ballast water or some other type of water. And the real problem is that, you know, it can be hard enough finding a single mussel on the side of your boat, but they have a larval stage, which is microscopic. You can't see it really with the naked eye. And that's this right here on the top left. And they're called veligers. And veligers, like I said, you can't really see them. You can feel them if you feel the side of your boat and it feels sort of like there's sandpaper texture. That can be a way of detecting them, but it is really tough to find them. So that creates a big problem because they can free float in water for really long periods of time and then become easily, just transported, flushed out into a new water body, or they can stick to something and be transported that way. That's why it's really important that we effectively clean, drain, and dry our watercraft before bringing them to a new body of water, because that's how we can ensure that things we don't see still aren't able to reproduce. So in terms of ID, I'm sure most of you know how to identify a zebra mussel. You've got the characteristic sort of zigzag patterns on the shell. They tend to be sort of yellowish white and brown, but color can vary. You've got, a very black or dark colored one here. And one of the key distinguishing features is that flat surface on the bottom of the mussel. So Lake Simcoe also has a lot of something called quagga mussels. Actually, they're sort of beginning to outcompete zebra mussels at this point. And one of the distinguishing, the ways that you can really tell the difference most easily between quagga mussels and zebra mussels is that flat surface on a zebra mussel. Now, when it comes to impacts of zebra mussels, it's fairly obvious that zebra mussels make water clear. They filter water, specifically they filter phytoplankton or algae out of our water. And this initially seems like a great thing to a lot of people. It's nice for cottagers, it's nice for boating. It's great when I'm looking down a hole and I can see 15 feet down there. But it's not so great for the ecosystem because phytoplankton are sort of the base forage base for the overall aquatic ecology of that system. So zooplankton eat phytoplankton, and a lot of bait fish and other aquatic organisms eat zooplankton as well as the phytoplankton. And then, of course, our sport fish eat bait fish. And so when you eliminate or reduce the amount of algae and phytoplankton in the system, you dramatically alter that whole aquatic ecology. And that's a real problem. It negatively impacts native clam populations as well, and can negatively impact the sport fish that we love so much. On top of it all, zebra mussels are they can be picky when it comes to the algae that they do consume. So just like us, zebra mussels don't like blue-green algae. They will actually spit it out. And what that means is they're filtering, they're consuming the algae that is not so problematic, and then spitting out the algae that is problematic. Blue-green algae is toxic, and it increases the overall concentrations of blue-green algae in a water body and ends up generally increasing algal blooms. And I'm sure a lot of you know about algal blooms because we've been experiencing them in Southern Ontario with sort of increasing regularity in certain water bodies. Beyond that, they're just a serious biofouler. They clog up water intakes and equipment, and they actually cost, I think it's billions of dollars in damage across North America every year. So they're a pain, and they're a hazard as well. And this is our current distribution map, except with one exception. In 2019, zebra mussel villagers were detected in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed over here. But other than that, this is what we're looking at. So once again, they sort of follow that line of where people are, mostly. So now we're going to talk about a little less known species that is already in Lake Simcoe, and that is spiny water flea. This is a predatory zooplankton, meaning that it eats other zooplankton. And originally native to Eurasia, and it was first detected in Lake Simcoe in 2004. Generally, this particular organism gets around in similar ways to a zebra mussel. Actually, it will, in the ballast water of ships, once again, through recreational boating in general. So it can easily float in your live well or a little bit of water at the back, by your transom, by your battery. A lot of water often collects there. It gets caught up in angling equipment, as you can see here. It's on line, a fishing line here. And of course, in bait buckets, as is the theme today. So it's easily transported in someone's bait bucket, and they may not see it because, as you can tell, individuals are very small, very, very small. And when it's on something, when they're all collected like this, they kind of look like just a little clump of algae. So it's pretty easy to miss them as well. That's especially problematic because spiny water flea are pretty unique in that they have the ability to clone themselves, meaning that you only need one female in a water body to potentially infest it. And on top of that, if conditions aren't right for them to sort of clone themselves and reproduce normally, they actually will produce something called resting eggs, which follow the bottom and wait for ideal conditions. But they're so hardy, these eggs, that they can dry out, they can be frozen, and then they can come back to life when introduced to water. So it really makes being sure that you're cleaning things down and you're not dumping your bait really important. When it comes to impacts that these organisms have, because they're predatory zooplankton, they actually cause, on average, a decrease of 30 to 40% in the native zooplankton population, which is a real problem for the same reason that the reduction caused by zebra mussels is a problem, because that baseline, that forage base, is suddenly reduced by 40%. Has a massive rippling effect throughout the aquatic ecosystem. And you might think, well, they're zooplankton, so they would just replace the hole, sort of fill the hole they've created. But as the name suggests, and as these pictures show, spiny water flea are very spiny. So they're actually really difficult for a lot of fish to eat. And so they ultimately don't really fill in that gap. I just want to point out, guys, I'm not sure how much this is happening, but if questions occur to you throughout the presentation, just feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A now if you want, and then we'll get to them at the end, or you can wait. That's just fine. So spiny water fleas also cause damage to commercial and recreational equipment, as once again you can see here. They sort of just gum it up, and as a result, they tend to be first noticed actually by anglers or commercial fishermen. Usually when there's a new infestation, those are the people who see them first. So this, yeah, that is correct. This is a distribution map of spiny water flea in Ontario, and the blue circles are not confirmed. They're negative. So just pay attention to the red ones. And as you can see, it has actually been able to sort of spread a little bit more widely than some of the other invasives. So the last species the last invasive we're going to talk about in great detail is actually not, what you might expect. It's not an organism in the conventional sense. It's a pathogen. So viral hemorrhagic septicemia. It's a disease that goes between fish, and you can identify it through these characteristics. So the pale gills and organs, a bloated abdomen, bulging eyes, as you can see in the image here, hemorrhaging, hence the name, an overall darker body color. These are all signs that it's present, but a fish doesn't necessarily have to have any of these to have it, similar to COVID, as we're all experiencing. And it's really problematic because VHS can cause serious fish die-offs, and it has, particularly in some of the Great Lakes. Now, this disease was first detected in Lake Simcoe in 2011, so it's, compared to the others, it's fairly recent. Outbreaks are most common in the spring, when temperatures are fluctuating and when fish are spawning, because there's so much direct contact, all these fish coming together, pretty common for a lot of diseases. And it affects a wide range of fish species, from bait fish like emerald shiners, the classics, blunt-nosed minnows, to our favorite sport fish, walleye, bass, muskie, perch, lots and lots of species, and that's a real issue. And this is just another image of, I believe these are alewife, if I'm not mistaken, with the hemorrhaging, the splotchy sort of hemorrhaging on them. So it's important to mention that VHS is not a risk to humans. I know that when people hear that it's in Lake Simcoe, they might worry about their perch fries or something like that. It's not an issue. You can handle and eat fish with VHS safely. It's just a problem for the ecosystems. It's a problem for the fisheries. So to prevent the spread of this, I want to take a minute to focus on that specifically because it's a little more unique. The obvious things, once again, are to dispose of your bait and the contents of a bait bucket properly and legally. So don't dump the water back into the lake or any, within 30 meters of the lake. Don't move fish. If you are getting bait fish, try and keep it as local as possible. And of course, as we're going to learn very soon, it's actually the law now to buy your bait fish locally. And inspect your equipment, obviously clean, drain, and dry your equipment. And the last thing is a little more unique. What we actually recommend is that if you can, bring a spray bottle of a 10% household bleach water solution with you when you're going out angling in a boat. And what that is 9 parts water, 1 part bleach. And you can spray the inside of your live well with that solution, and that will kill VHS. Unfortunately, freezing and such does not kill it, but that solution will, and then you rinse out the system with clean water outside of 30 meters from the waterway, of course, and you're good to go, and that shouldn't cause any problems. And then you've hopefully prevented spreading that, because it doesn't actually just reside in fish. It can actually exist just in water and spread that way as well. And so now that we've talked about some species that are already in Lake Simcoe, we're going to talk about a few that are not, just to make that clear. None of these species are. But I just wanted to give sort of a little bit of an introduction to a couple threats to Lake Simcoe, things that we don't want to get here, because after going over all these species, I think it should be hopefully pretty clear that this is something that we don't want to spread to other places. But it's really important to also point out, even if Lake Simcoe does have a lot of aquatic invasive species, and in fact, it has the most of any inland, so non-Great Lake lake in Ontario, there are lots and lots of aquatic invasive species that are not yet in Lake Simcoe, and we really don't want them to get there. So just a few examples of species that are not too far away and would create a big problem. So the first one, grass carp, that's an Asian carp species. And it's not particularly close, but it's just something that we always want to mention, Asian carp, because they're a real threat. New Zealand mud snail is another one. These little tiny snails here are in certain parts of Ontario and cause serious ecological damage. Chinese and banded mystery snails. These are particularly bad in the Haliburton area right now. And we've got some work going on for removing them there, actually, but they're throughout some different parts of Ontario. And these cause a number of issues with local snail populations and other issues with parasites that can actually go to ducks and waterfowl, for instance. And then fishhook water flea is another species that we always want to be on the lookout for. Fairly similar to spiny water flea, but not in the system, and obviously has a much longer tail. But like I said, there's lots of species that are not yet there, and we don't want them to get there. So it's really important that we're responsible as anglers and are really mindful of what we're doing, whether we're on the ice and using live bait or dead bait, or whether we're on a boat and trailering and paying attention to what's on our boat and whether or not we're draining it and all those wonderful things. So now we can get to the really fun stuff, which is the new bait regulations. So as of January 1st, meaning 13 days ago, Ontario now has new regulations pertaining to the use of live and dead bait in Ontario. And like I said, I'm sure this is going to bring up plenty of questions. So if you have any, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, or just put up the virtual hand at the end of the presentation, and hopefully I or Brenda can clarify on that. So basically now Ontario is officially divided into 4 sections, 4 bait fish management zones, or BMZs. And you can see them here, illustrated here. So you've got the Southern Ontario BMZ in yellow, the Central Ontario BMZ in dark brown, the Northeastern BMZ in green, and the Northwestern in orange. And these numbers are not BMZ numbers, just to be clear. These are actually FMZ numbers, so our fisheries management zones that we've been using and will continue to use for recreational angling. They just put them in here for a point of reference. That's especially good for us in the Lake Simcoe area, because you can see that the sort of dividing line between the southern BMZ, where we are, and the central BMZ is actually the border of zone 15. So that helps things, at least it helps for me. But these rules, what they mean, one of the things that they're including is that it is now prohibited to transport bait fish or leeches, whether alive or dead, into or out of a BMZ. So if you purchase or trap bait fish or leeches, you can't bring them into another BMZ. Harvesting of bait fish and leeches by anglers, that is, so not commercially, now may only occur within our home BMZs, meaning where our residential addresses, where we live. So if I live in the Kawarthas and am going to the central BMZ to Huntsville or something like that, I can't go trap in the central BMZ, and I cannot bring bait fish that I did trap in my home BMZ into that one. So it's an important distinction. Now, that begs the obvious question: what happens if I'm in another BMZ and I want bait fish or leeches? If you're in a BMZ outside of your home bait fish management zone, you have to purchase bait fish or leeches locally, meaning within that BMZ, from a commercial license holder. You have to be able to produce a legible receipt. So we have to ask for receipts, and you have to use or dispose of that bait, whether it's alive or dead, within 2 weeks of purchase. And then down here, we just have a little list of the things that need to be on the receipt. So date of purchase, business name, if it's applicable, commercial license number, location of purchase, and the quantity of bait purchased. Now, when I mentioned earlier, there's some exceptions, and this is one of them. The Great Lakes and the Ottawa River tend to be sort of hotbeds for invasive species. I think generally because of just the traffic, and particularly commercial traffic historically. So there's a lot of aquatic invasive species in those systems, and we really don't want them to come inland. So there's sort of special rules for the Great Lakes and the Ottawa River. What these rules are is, you can see the arrows here. You are allowed to transport bait from a BMZ that is adjacent to that Great Lake. So if you want to fish, this part of Lake Huron, and you have bait fish from the southern BMZ, you can do that. What you can't do, though, is pass through another BMZ to do that. So you cannot transport bait overland through another BMZ to use in the Great Lakes. Conversely, you can't do the reverse of this, meaning that we cannot trap bait fish in a Great Lake and use it inland, even if it's in an adjacent BMZ. Once again, I think that's because these Great Lakes are such hotbeds, and we want to keep that away from the inland waters. The same thing applies to the Ottawa River for the same reason. So that is sort of the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to go over today. I've just got a few resources here. So if you want information on profiles, pathways, just general resources, this is our website, www.invadingspecies.com. We have all sorts of stuff. Like I said, this certainly wasn't an extensive review of all the aquatic invasive species in the area. We have lots of information on lots of species. So go to that website and you'll find probably what you're looking for. Specifically for Asian carp information, we have asiancarp.ca. That's a great resource. If you're looking sort of higher level, particularly for invasives from across the continent, other parts of North America, you can go to the USGS website here, and it's got a very extensive library of information, I suppose. For reporting, there are a number of options, but in terms of just websites, we generally direct you to EDMAPS. So you've got edmaps.org down here, EDD Maps. And that is a website and an app that allows you to report potential invasive species. And then within Ontario, it actually goes to us and we're able to confirm it or say if it's negative and hopefully follow up, it's, you know, and make a difference that way. And then for more information on what the Ontario government is doing to prevent the spread of AIS and also on the new regulations, you can go to this website right here, ontario.ca, and Managing Invasive Species Ontario. And I mentioned that there are other ways to report, so you can also see the hotline number right up here to get in touch with us directly. You can call this number and report an invasive species sighting that way as well. So now that the majority of the presentation is done, we're at a great place to take questions and have a bit of discussion here. Why don't I stop sharing? Well, actually, I'll leave it up for a little bit so people can copy down emails and such if they want to. But I'm going to take a look at the Q&A. And once again, if you don't want to put your question in the chat, you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you that way. So we've got many boats have bait buckets that fit into the live well on the boat. So you buy minnows locally and put them in this portable pail. When you go fishing, you insert this bucket into your live well on that boat with the minnows to keep them alive. Can you still do this? Brenda, did you understand that?
Hi, Matt. Yes. Trying to start my video here. Is that coming through?
I'm not seeing it right now. Here, I'll stop sharing for right now.
I'm just going to move my phone because I think it's interfering. 1 second.
Yep, no problem.
There we go. Okay. I've tried to share the video, but it doesn't seem to work. Anyways, while we're I'm trying to get that working, I can address that question. So that's a really good question. This is referring to a change that we had in the Ontario fishery regulations last year. So section 28 now is the section that prohibits much more than it used to, but it basically says that a person can't release or deposit or attempt to do that into any waters, the list of the following. So it's live or dead bait or bait fish, including fish eggs, gametes, or parts, or the water, soil, or other materials in the container used to hold the materials set out in paragraph A. So when you read that, you would think that, you know, you might not be able to do the thing that you're asking about, where you've got bait fish in a little bucket and now you want to put them into your live well to keep them fresh in there. You can actually do that, but what you need to do is decant the water first. So just use that bait bucket as a sieve, drain the water on land 30 meters away from the waters of Ontario. And then with the fish in your little bait bucket, that's basically acting like a net or a sieve, you can then insert that into your live well. So the prohibition really says that you can't dump water, and that's why you would have to take that step to sort of decant the water and then put the minnows in there, the little bucket inside the live wells. That's the extra step you need to take now.
Yeah, and the reasoning for that, again, guys, is that, you know, the water itself can harbor things that you may not see. So it could be VHS, it could be a zebra mussel villager. So it is really important to you know, treat the water in your bait bucket and the actual organisms in your bait bucket equally and dispose of them properly. We've got another question here that says, can you explain what you have to do with bait you bought outside of your home zone at the end of the fishing day if you've headed home? So for instance, FMZ 15 back to FMZ 17. I think I can answer this one pretty effectively. Unfortunately, it means you just need to dispose of it. So whether that's dumping it outside of 30 meters from the waterway, or putting it in the garbage, or killing it and disposing of it in some other way that doesn't involve it being close to the water body. But unfortunately, it does not allow you to bring that bait across the border of the BMZ to then freeze or something like that, like you might normally do. Would you say that covers it, Brenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was, Matt, a question at the top of that Q&A that came up at the beginning too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it says, can you transport dead sucker minnows from one zone to another?
So I can address that one if you like. So definitely there is an exemption in the new rules that allows a person to do that. So it's applying to dead long-nosed sucker and dead suckers. And the purpose really here is so that the fish could be moved into a bait management zone for the purposes of consumption. And so the exemption, if you look at it, it does exist in section 30.6. So it's dead long-nosed sucker, white sucker, and the exemption also applies to lake herring. What it says is that the rules around moving bait into or out of a bait management zone do not apply to those fish as long as they're dead. However, the other rules around the use and possession of bait, they still apply. And so what this means is that someone who is moving dead long-nosed sucker or dead white sucker, for example, into a bait management zone from another bait management zone can't use them in the bait management zone they've moved them to as bait. The law does prohibit the use as bait. It really is just to enable people to move those for consumption.
All right, we've got another one here from Lori that says, if I harvest bait fish from my stream, I'm not going to have a receipt. What do I do then? Certainly not. I think Brenda, you'd be better for that one as well.
Yeah, so that's a good question to ask. So just to get some clarity on when you need to use receipts. So a receipt is only required if you are using bait outside your home zone. So where your primary residence is located is what we consider the home bait management zone. And for example, if you live in the southern bait management zone and you want to go fishing in the central bait management zone, the rules say that you need to buy your bait in the central bait management zone. So if you are using bait in areas where you need to purchase it because you can't harvest it, you need to have a receipt. And so somebody who is buying bait in their home zone, they are not required to have a receipt. That same person also, of course, can harvest their own bait. But as soon as you're outside the bait management zone where your primary residence is, you need to buy bait in the zone where you're going to be fishing, and then you need to have a legible receipt, which you need to be able to produce to a conservation officer if you're asked. And as Matt pointed out, there's required information that you need to have on that receipt. The other thing to think about here, of course, is if your primary residence is in the southern zone, for example, and your cottage is in the central zone, the central bait management zone, you will not be able to harvest your bait in the central bait management zone because your primary residence is not located there.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the clarification on that. I see the elaboration there, Lori, and I actually think I may have corresponded with you over email over this sort of subject recently, so that's glad that you've made it to the info session here. All right, so we have one on the regulations mentioning alive or dead bait fish. How do regulations treat frozen dead bait or salted dead minnows? Well, if I'm not mistaken, it's just considered dead bait fish and can't be transported over the BMZs. at the moment, right, Brenda?
Yeah, absolutely. So the rules apply to bait fish, whether they're live or dead. And it does not make a difference if they're frozen or if they are salted. The rules apply in both cases, live or dead.
Oh, Evan says your voice is garbled. Who's that? Is that me or Brenda or both? Is everybody else having, oh, me, it's me. Okay. All right, let's see if I get a little closer here. Did that cause issues for the presentation?
It was good during the presentation, Matt. I thought it was actually on my end here, but clearly it's not. I don't know if something's changed at your end in the positioning of something.
Don't think so. All right, well, it is what it is. So we've got somebody, Jason, saying anglers are curious about keeping bait, meaning a receipt can be used, but it is only valid for 2 weeks. Can anglers use any dead / salted bait? Would this be included as bait under these regs, even though they're not live? So I think that's sort of the same question that we just talked about earlier. But I see where people are coming from, because I know historically you can buy sort of salted minnows even in Canadian Tire in the fishing aisles. So let's see.
Yeah, Matt, maybe I'll just jump in there for a second. I'm wondering if Jason is maybe referring to using other types of fish that are not bait fish as bait. So if you are asking about that, Jason, yeah, obviously in areas where the use of bait is allowed, if people are buying other species that are not bait fish. And so when we talk about bait fish, we're referring to the 48 species that are listed that you can use live as bait. The term is bait fish. It's legally defined. If you choose to try to use other types of bait, for example, say you go into your local grocery store and buy, well, frozen smelt as an example. There's nothing preventing you from using the frozen smelt. These new rules apply to bait fish, and smelt are not a bait fish. So you could use that as a source of bait in areas where the use of bait is allowed. But if it happens to be smelt, you just need to be careful. There are some areas of the province where you can't use smelt at all either. But just to clarify on that.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that. Our, follow up here is, our smelt considered bait fish? I think that'd be better for you, Brenda.
Oops, yeah, so smelts are not, they're not bait fish. They're not one of the 48 listed species. If people want to just double check that, I can't remember exactly what page it's on right now in the fishing regs summary, but the list of bait fish is, it's around page 19 or something like that. You can check to see what species the new rules apply to in terms of what things are considered bait fish. And just a reminder that in the future, that list will be slightly reduced, but that we're not there yet. There is part of the bait strategy proposal was to reduce the list of permitted bait fish species, but the legislative changes have not been made yet to implement that.
Similar question here about cut bait. So Jason is saying that many anglers use this for catfish and other species. Is there anything in the regulations that prevent this practice? Example, gizzard shad, white sucker, common red horse species are commonly used. So I suppose it's just the same question about what is a bait fish. I don't believe red horse sucker is. Sure right now. is white sucker on that list?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, white sucker is. And that is why actually we have the exemption for dead white sucker. But yeah, so that's a good question, Jason. One thing just to remember or think about is so if you're going to be using those species, if you buy them from a grocery store, you're fine. If you happen to harvest them, you know, yourself and would like to use pieces of them, we just have to remember there is a wastage prohibition in the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act that says, you know, you can't allow something that's suitable for human consumption to spoil. But, you know, if you're talking about certain parts of fish like fins or bellies, things that you would maybe not normally consider things that are for human consumption, then those can be used. So again, it's a question of referring back to the bait fish species list to make sure they're not listed on that list. And then the other applicable rules, well, around wastage and also areas where you can actually use bait as long as there's no, you know, nothing preventing you from using bait in an area.
Yeah, and I actually am looking at the list right now, and shorthead red horse, silver red horse are in fact on that list, if I was mistaken. It's quite extensive though. All right, makes sense. Smells. That's everything so far. Oh, now we have another one in the Q&A. Baitfish includes any parts or pieces of. When it comes to dumping, so for instance, when we're talking about dumping a bait bucket, it means any parts, you know, gametes, eggs, what you name it. In the context of using them for bait, I think that'd be better for you to address, Brenda.
Yeah, we're getting some really good questions. Yes, so Rick Stankiewicz, thanks for the question there. It is a good question. So yes, it does include parts, of course. If you take a bait fish and whack it in half, the rule is still applying to both halves of that fish. So it doesn't matter whether it's a whole fish or not. It's whether it happens to be a bait fish species. So that's the criterion there.
Great question. We have Ken saying, just for clarity, I'm fishing and purchasing bait minnows outside of my home DMZ, and at the end of the 2 weeks, I must dispose of the minnows. So it is not allowed to either freeze and or salt these minnows for future use. You can within that 2 week time period. I'm not sure if there's anything to elaborate on there, Brenda.
No, just that you know, you can't take them out of the bait management zone. You certainly can use them for the 2 weeks in any form, but when it comes time for you to leave, or 2 weeks is up, whatever comes first, you need to make sure you dispose of them properly. You can't continue to possess them.
We're getting a steady trickle of questions. George says, what is the logic in preventing me from harvesting bait fish in my cottage where I spend 90% of the summer? Fair question, George. I'm not going to try and speak on the behalf of the MNRs. I think probably you should do that as well, Brenda. NDMNRF, I mean, not the MNR.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a long acronym. Yeah, so that's a good question, and I know that this one is difficult for a lot of people, including myself. I mean, my sort of in the same situation, but at any rate, I think one of the things that very early on in the bait review, there was a number of statistics that were looked at in terms of people's ability to identify bait fish and, you know, personally harvested bait fish. One of the things that I think came to the forefront is that there's some challenges in terms of identification for people. So that's was one element of the puzzle. When we started to develop the rules, we needed to have a way to prevent the movement of bait fish and or leeches across boundaries, and really limiting the movement was tied to ecological risk. But one of the other elements that we ran into was if we were going to be letting people harvest wherever they went, then it really wouldn't be sort of, I think, restricting some of the movement of bait fish, number one, and also addressing the issue of, in some places, or in some instances, some people are not very good at identifying them. So it was a matter of balancing ecological risk versus still enabling people to do certain activities. And so when you look at how this is implemented, primary residence is something that on the ground we can determine about people in terms of, you know, if they present us with some ID, or, you know, we've got their outdoors card information, that type of thing. So where we landed on this was really just to enable people to be able to harvest their bait in the zone where their primary residence is, and be able to enforce that rule versus having people, you know, harvest bait in other locations and maybe not being as successful with limiting the movement. I think the other thing that came into the, you know, some of the discussions were also to have special types of licenses for people who were harvesting their own bait. And that wasn't seen to be a very good option. But if you want more details on, you know, how that decision was arrived at in terms of allowing people to harvest where their primary residence is versus where their secondary locations might be, I'd have to refer you to our policy department, but I can definitely pass that question along if more detail is required.
Yeah, it's an important question for sure, especially for people with cottages and such. Okay, so Mark says, if I'm fishing in my home zone and I don't need a receipt, my outdoors card doesn't have my address. What ID should I carry? That's a good question. Certainly, you know, your driver's license, your boating license should as well. Brenda, I'm sure you have a much more all-encompassing answer for that.
I can jump in on this one. So good question. And I'm sure lots of people are wondering about that. I know some of our communications have said you should have government issued ID. So, you know, we haven't really been prescriptive in terms of what ID you must carry. That's not captured in the law. Really what the way this is going to be implemented is that if you happen to be stopped by a conservation officer, obviously they may be asking you some questions about what you're doing. Those questions too, of course, may lead to an understanding of where you're from, where your primary residence may be located. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every enforcement interaction will require you to produce some identification. Some of them might, If you are asked to produce some ID, obviously a driver's license, that's a useful thing to give. If you are somebody who needs to have a fishing license that you've purchased, your license summary would have your address on it. That's an acceptable way of showing where your primary residence is. Your outdoors card doesn't have your address on it, as you pointed out, Mark, but you know, if an officer was wondering about where you're from, they can run your card and check to make sure that the information is in fact correct. Yeah, so typically, if you have any government issued ID that includes your address, those types of identification are useful.
There's lots of options. And chances are you might already have something like that on you. Fishing, you may have, you know, voter card or something like it. There always seems to be a question popping up at the last minute here, so I'm just don't want to get it too soon. Okay, well, if there are no other questions right now, you know, if you think of something, oh, ML cards have your address on it. So there you go. One more to the list. Thanks, Alan. Right. So yeah, if that's it for now, if you guys do think of any questions, feel free to, you know, give me an email directly. Also, I think Brooke, my colleague who was originally going to be presenting with me, his information was on the last slide as well. You can get in touch anytime or contact the Invading Species Awareness Program directly as well, and we'll be happy to answer anything, any question you want. Actually, why don't I share my screen one more time here to show that contact information once more. So there's Brooke Schreier's email, my email, Matthew Robbins, and the email to the program in general, in case something else comes up. Otherwise, we will be having a similar presentation info session on the 27th of this month, also 7 p.m. And we'll be going over more boater pathway stuff. So species that are more pertinent to boating. So that includes a lot of vegetation and other things, including some of the species we may be talking about today. And we're also going to be discussing the new boater pathway regulations that also just came into the law. So it'd be great to see all of you guys or some of you guys there as well, and we'll be happy to answer any questions just like today. But thanks again for coming out. It's been great. I hope to see you next in a couple of weeks. Guidelines.